Hey everyone, welcome to the International Politics and Drugs Replacement Lecture for July 25th, 2019. In this set of slides, we're going to be talking about how drug traffickers relate to other sorts of violent groups in their midst, in particular, how they relate with insurgent groups. For this set of slides, we're going to focus on the relationship between Peruvian coca growers and the traffickers that take their harvests to market, and Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, a long-running Marxist insurgency that terrorized the Peruvian countryside for a number of years. In the next set of slides, which I'll post in a different video, we're going to look at a similar set of relationships in northern Mali, in the Maghreb and the Sahara regions of northern Africa, where a long-running independence movement and some jihadist movements have also interfaced with drug trafficking organizations there. Okay, so what is Felbab Brown's puzzle? What is the author after here? Well, we've all seen these anti-drug advertisements that stress the connection between drugs and terrorism or drugs and insurgency, and probably most of us have been somewhat skeptical that the connection here was all that strong. And in fact, at some point in the United States, these ads that pushed this connection were taken off of the air. But there are credible sources and credible reporting that shows that there's money being traded in the illicit economy here. Now, having been through as much of this class as you have, you're probably aware that the media is likely to provide a framing for these relationships that makes it look substantially more hierarchical or organized than it actually is. But if you see these reports, there's probably something to it. There's probably money exchanging hands, although it may not be clear how often it happens or what it's for. So Felbab Brown wants to get to the bottom of this. What is the real relationship between illicit economies and insurgency? How and when are these two facets of sort of subaltern society related to one another? Okay, Felbab Brown's theory. This is relatively complicated, so we're going to go through it in some detail here. The first thing we want to lay out are the actors. Who are the players that are actually involved here? The first are the belligerents. These are the insurgent groups. They are interested by assumption, by the author's assumption. They're interested in maximizing their chance to survive into the next round of the insurgency, and then the next round and the next round. They want to maximize the longevity of their organization. And they're interested in doing so because they want to take and hold territory from the state. They want to use their violence, their violent capacity to engineer social outcomes differently than the state will. They are in direct competition with the state over multiple spheres of influence, not just particular economies like drug cartels might be. And they may be willing to punish or facilitate the drug trade as a result. They have public policy preferences about whether or not drugs are used or trafficked through their territory, and they may wish to behave consistently with those preferences in order to make it look to the population as though they are providing the sort of government that makes them competitive with the state. Second actor then obviously is the state. They want to defeat the rebels. They have the same set of choices. They're interested in projecting their power into rebel-held or rebel-influenced territory, and engineer the social outcomes that the state prefers using its violent capacity. Then we have traffickers. These are the international supply chains for the illegal drugs. It's what we've been focusing on mostly during this class, but of course the traffickers don't get their product from anywhere. There are local farmers who have local roots. They are embedded in communities. They care about the long-term health of their communities, and their major incentive for participating in the drug trade probably has to do with the money or the stability that it brings to their community. So notice that these actors all have differing interests with respect to the drug trade, right? For the moment, the most important ones to consider are that of the traffickers and the farmers. They each want to maximize profit at the expense of the other. The traffickers want to pay for as little, they want to pay as little for the farmer's product as possible, and the farmers want to get as much money as possible out of the traffickers. We should also note that the state is generally opposed to drugs and drug trafficking for reasons of international aid or pressure. Most of these states at this point in time are being told that um, places, destination markets like the United States and Europe would prefer not to receive drugs from places like Peru, and so the government receives some of its aid conditional on its cooperation with the United States or Europe. In particular, in the case of Peru, what we tend to see is that the United States is providing military aid to the state, and the military aid is supposed to be used for drug intervention, but of course, if you're training soldiers and you're getting helicopters and you have all these assets, you can use those things equally to suppress parts of your population that aren't related to drugs or threaten the outside world and get what you want from countries that are neighboring to you. Okay, so let's build out this relationship a little bit. The most basic relationship we have here is between an independent variable that assesses the extent to which and the direction in which belligerents intervene in the drug market, right? So we have three basic values here. We have a negative value in which rebels punish participants in the drug market because they want to socially engineer anti-drug outcomes in the societies that they want to control. We have a neutral one in which the rebel simply withdraws from the drug market. And we have a positive relationship in which the belligerents participate directly in a way that facilitates, either by providing protection. We'll see a bunch of the other strategies that a belligerent might use to participate positively in the illicit economy in the coming slides. Okay, well, the value and magnitude of this intervention has an effect on a couple of dependent variables. The first dependent variable is the military capacity of the belligerent group. So, to what extent do they have the raw materials to fight the state, the weapons, um, the ability to maintain secrecy, these sort of things, to increase their operational theater? And then the second dependent variable is political capital, which is local goodwill, the extent to which the local population supports the insurgents. Now, of course, these two dependent variables are closely related to one another. The more political goodwill an insurgent group has in the territory they seek to control, the more likely the people are going to maintain the secrecy of the group, the more likely they are to pay taxes that fund new weapons, the more likely they are to allow their children to be recruited into the insurgency. So the political capital, Felbab Brown argues, dovetails directly into the military capacity of these groups. And this is a part of her theory that's well supported by a variety of other literatures on insurgency. But this relationship isn't entirely straightforward. There are a handful of intervening variables that we need to discuss in greater detail that determine the extent to which a belligerent's intervention in the drug market can generate these types of capital. They change the magnitude of the effect. So an insurgent who intervenes in a particular drug market, the returns that they receive from that investment are going to be determined in part by the health of the local economy, by whether the drug market in question requires a lot of civilian labor, and whether or not the traffickers themselves are abusing the local farmers or the local populations. Here is the figure in which Felbab Brown lays this out, just to show you that one of the ways that you might approach reading texts like this for this class in the future is to sort of deconstruct each of these elements, go back to the text and see where each of these elements of the theory is sort of supported. If you're ever really confused by a reading that you need to understand really well, start with the figures and work backwards. So a good slide for studying maybe. Okay, so what's the cost-benefit analysis here? What's the theory about why rebel groups would want to be involved in the illicit economy? Well, first, we get military capacity. Let's look into this just a little bit more, right? Here, our example of the Shining Path. The way that the Shining Path received weapons or got weapons early in its campaign was to raid police stations or military outposts and steal their weapons. Their weaponry at this point was very limited. They could only provide guns to as many soldiers as they had raided police stations, and that put a pretty strong cap on their ability to grow. And Felbab Brown points out that once Shining Path starts to get involved in the illicit drug trade, the group can start to afford some pretty sophisticated weapons. Political capacity, dig into this just a little bit more. These sorts of service provision behaviors require, as we've seen in Scott and Tilly, the ability to feed and serve and protect a population, require that the insurgent organization gathers good intelligence that allows it to provide these services more efficiently. And so you need political and military capital not only to fight your enemy, but also to provide services to your supposed allies, the platform populations or constituencies that you want to support you. This creates sort of a virtuous cycle for the insurgents. The more capacity they have to penetrate society, change social outcomes, provide these services, the more political goodwill they earn from the people, and therefore the more military and political capacity they have to further engineer social outcomes by expelling the state and providing services within the economy. Now, we've seen some of these service provision behaviors before. Drug cartels do these things. We talked a lot about this in the lecture about La Familia. But they are obviously even more important to a group that's planning explicitly to take over the state, right? Drug cartels only need to demonstrate their willingness to provide services that come from their drug rents and to mitigate the problems that arise when you have traffickers or producers in this illicit trade in your communities. Here, the Shining Path and similar groups want to set up an entire governance infrastructure that is separate from the state, and so they need to provide a much broader range of services that are much more stable to demonstrate that they are a better alternative for government. In return, the civilians provide their own performance. They can withhold information from the state, they can pay taxes, without resistance, right? We know, again, particularly from Tilly, that the government can go out and seize taxes. We know from Scott that they can go out and create these onerous regimes that soak people's money up. But if people are willing to pay taxes, it saves you quite a substantial amount of money. This is part of Tilly's main point. And Mao and Lenin, your major revolutionary generals, argue that this sort of insurgent support or support for insurgency is critical to rebel successes. Mao, once famously said that the people are the sea in which the revolutionary fish must swim. So we need to be cultivating this military and political capacity, which we can do through involvement in the illicit economy. We'll talk a little bit more about how in a couple of slides, specifically how. But of course there's a cost, right? One of the major drawbacks that Felbab Brown discusses is that involvement in the illicit economy lowers the operational flexibility of the insurgency. What do we mean by that? Well, essentially what we mean by that is that the government can draw rebels out by assaulting drug producers. They force the rebels to keep their promises. There's now a population to which the rebel group owes protection. Right? And this might remind you of Gambetta, who made the argument that mafias need to provide real protection from extortion. They need to be able to deploy their violent capacity in order to mitigate the abuses that other institutions are heaping on the people that they wish to serve. So now you have something of a potential puzzle for an insurgency, right? They don't want to get themselves involved too deeply with a constituency that stays in one place all the time until they feel like they can actually protect that constituency and the services they're providing to that constituency from the state. So there's a little bit of a question about when we should get involved in the illicit economy in order to reap these benefits. Here again is a good review slide, just a list of the exchange that's happening here. This should look familiar. These are the sorts of exchanges that states provide, that citizens engage with their states all the time. And it should look like a much more robust and complete version of some of the drug trafficking organizations' behaviors that we've seen, particularly La Familia. Okay, quick digression to clean up a couple of points that are important to the theory but kind of hang off the side. First, why should the insurgents focus on the illicit economy? If they have designs to replace the state, why shouldn't they be providing protection for everyone? Well, there are a couple of reasons that you might use the illicit economy to jumpstart the ability of your insurgency to provide results. The first is that these groups often need protection, so you have quick cash, right? Um, as we've seen in the case of the Mexican Mafia, for example, these organizations are unprotected, and that lack of protection leads to internecine violence, violence between the groups that are engaged in drug trafficking or drug sales or drug production. So if you can bring order to that society, it's a place where you can create some quick income. And then second, because the state is normally involved in prohibition, is at best neutrally involved in the drug market, the need is high and the competition is also low. If you're the only insurgent game in town, the state is likely to not join you in protecting drug economies, although we'll see that this varies in the case of the Shining Path. Separate problem. There are literatures in the study of insurgency that argue that an insurgent group's main connection to its population is its ideology. Insurgent groups oftentimes arise when the state is abusive, and insurgent groups often claim, at least, to be offering a different governance solution that's based on an ideology that's intended to maximize or increase income or security for the peasants. This is especially true of Marxism, and especially true of the way that Marxism relates to drugs. Right? You've all heard the quote that religion is the opiate of the masses. Well, of course, religion isn't the only opiate of the masses. Opiates are also an opiate of the masses, and Lenin and Marx and Mao all strongly, strongly disapproved of allowing locals access to drugs. They believed that it eroded communities, they believed that it eroded class consciousness, that it turned otherwise revolutionary workers into willing sheep for the capitalist engine. So, what happens when your Marxist revolution embraces a drug trafficking organization as a source of income? Do civilians lose interest? And Felbab Brown says empirically this isn't true. What these peasants care about first and foremost is having protection and stability in the markets in which they participate. And if the state isn't providing that, they're going to prefer whatever insurgents do provide it. Okay. So, the basic mechanism here is that rebels can increase income and goodwill among the population by providing protection for a group of people that are often abused by the state. Let's take a look at how some of these mediating conditions actually work to change the extent to which insurgent groups can get income and political goodwill, can generate these resources from providing protection to the illicit economy. Well, the first is the question of how easily an abused drug producer can leave for another job or join another sector in the economy. So think about this from the perspective of a Peruvian cocalero. If you literally have no option in your life but coca growing, you really, really appreciate a rebel group that shows up to protect you. If, however, you have the education and the economic freedom that allows you to just get up and leave for the city, if coca growing becomes too dangerous or too unprofitable, you can always move to Lima and work as an accountant if the drug market gets too violent. You're probably more ambivalent about the introduction of an insurgent group into your economy. The second issue is labor intensivity, and this refers to the extent to which the economy generates real employment in the drug market. How many people are employed? How much money are the belligerents really protecting? So, of course, the relationship here is that the more money and the more people are involved in the drug trade, the more your protection is going to provide dividends. If you have a labor unintensive drug market that the insurgency protects, you have limited political capital to gain because relatively few people care that you're protecting them. You're protecting relatively few people. But where your drug market is labor intensive, where there are lots of people who are involved in it, where there's a lot of money at stake, of course you're generating more political goodwill, and of course you're generating more taxes. The behavior of traffickers. Trafficker behavior gives rise to two issues. First, you may think that it would be worth it to ally with traffickers or to provide protection to traffickers for some kind of price. So there's tension that arises here with another group that has some amount of arms over how much the traffickers are going to pay for your protection and over whether that protection helps or harms local producers. This strategy might set you at odds with your supposed allies, with the drug producers. So, to what extent are you going to get involved in maintaining the security of someone whose interests, at some points, diverge from the interests of the local population? This again may remind you of some of the games we discussed with respect to Gambetta's description of the mafia, right? It shouldn't be surprising that the insurgent groups are similar in some ways to the state oriented model of mafia behavior. So there's a lot of things we're seeing here, even though we're not talking about drug trafficking organizations directly, in the insurgents' behavior that are consistent with Gambetta's model. And here we have this question about the extent to which we take on the protection of groups that might be rival to our citizens. How do we offer protection to all of these groups at the same time? How do we mediate between their disputes and collect taxes from both of them? Notice that our government, right, the government of the United States, the government of developed nations, is pretty substantially advanced in this category, right? There are obviously citizens who are abused or whose interests are neglected, but to businesses that have some dispute over commercial matters, to citizens that have some dispute over property or some social dispute, can typically go to the United States government and be treated more or less equally. The government is expert at mediating between these divergent interests. It does it in the courts and with the police all the time, and the vast majority of those interactions are relatively fair and not directly violent. Well, an insurgent organization is expanding into conflicting markets for the first time, so there's no institutional memory, there's no organizational capacity to manage these conflicts. So the question of whether or not an insurgent group should ally with traffickers is one that can be somewhat fraught for this reason. The second question is whether and the extent to which you ought to ally with producers, right? If the traffickers are particularly abusive to the producers, you can again leverage this for a lot of gratitude, but then you will probably lose some of your ability to tax the traffickers. If the traffickers are nice, though, the producers may feel like they don't need that much protection, which again sort of undermines your ability to build political capital. If you're swooping in, Mighty Mouse style, and rescuing this constituency from something that's really quite violent, you build up a lot more political capital, which you can translate into military capital. But if everything's going along just fine, less so. The last potential intervening variable that determines how much the population needs you and therefore how much capital you get out of your investment in protecting them is the government's response to the illicit economy. The government has a similar suite of options to react to the illicit economy, as do the rebels, right? Remember, we had positive, neutral, and negative intervention in the illicit economy as options for our independent variable. Well, the government may choose to prohibit, tolerate, or legalize drugs. And these responses on the government's behalf influence the rebels' best options, right? Imagine yourself as a revolutionary general and you are trying to decide how much political goodwill and how much military capacity you would build by protecting drug producers. And the government decides to change from a regime of tolerance to a regime of legalization. That should alter your best response to the government, right? And so going way back now to the game theory week, remember what a Nash equilibrium means. A Nash equilibrium occurs when both parties have reached a decision in the game that they can't change to benefit themselves, right? So you might ask whether there's really a Nash equilibrium in this game. If the government prohibits drugs, then maybe the best response of the insurgents is to protect the drug markets, in which case the government responds by legalizing, in which case the insurgents leave, in which case the government isn't getting much out of legalization anymore. They're probably just alienating their allies, so they withdraw, in which case the insurgents return. So it's possible that this is a game without a Nash equilibrium. No matter what your opposition does, as long as they change, your best response changes too. Okay, so why eradicate, right? Why would the government eradicate if they know, or prohibit, if they know that prohibition um, leads to the possibility or generates the opportunity for insurgent groups to provide protection and therefore build capital, right? It's tempting to remove a rebel income source, is the main idea. We notice that the rebels are using the illicit economy to generate income, and we know that if we move in as the government and try and legalize and provide our own protection for drug traffickers or drug producers, that we're going to lose our allies. And so we're tempted to react, even to the left of prohibition. We start to eradicate, we try and rip the drugs out root and stem. The problem, Felbab Brown notes, is that this is rarely successful in a tactical sense. It's very, very difficult to go find um, drug production farms and actually rip out all of the coca plants. And when you do rip out all of the coca plants, what you've really done is raise the prices of the coca that's left over. And so the farmers are realizing sort of a stable return if the demand for the drug is relatively inflexible or inelastic. So interdiction is slightly better than eradication because it doesn't alienate the producer population by targeting them with violence. That you actually instead target the drug trafficking organizations, you interdict against them. When done well, this can lower the prices that are offered to farmers and undercut the belligerent's tax price. So there's sort of a needle you've got to thread here, Felbab Brown argues, if you want to go on the prohibition side. You definitely don't want to engage in a radical style of eradication, but it's possible that successful intervention against the traffickers, those who are buying the drug producers' output, can be targeted in ways that are good. There are limits to the political gains that can be realized by decriminalization. As belligerents can tax freely now, right? One of the things that's true about decriminalization or toleration is that the insurgent groups can now tax freely. The economy comes out into the light. Legalization, straight up legalization or licensing, undercuts both of the opportunities for an insurgent group to gain money or political goodwill from drug trafficking organizations, but then the government has to deal with other governments' ire that it's sponsoring drug trafficking, or it has to try and find legal outlets for all of this coca or production. From the government's perspective, then, you have this problem, this dilemma. How do you make the producers happy? These are your citizens. These are people whose support you need to provide information about the insurgents and resistance against the insurgents. While at the same time you're undercutting rents to traffickers to make your international allies happy, not alienate those major donors by facilitating the drug trade. So this is quite a needle to thread, and it puts the government on its back foot with respect to the strategies that are available to it to consider insurgency. So some hypotheses. We've now laid out a theory about the consequences of positive and negative rebel intervention in illicit economies. Rebels get benefits from positive intervention, and the value of these benefits depends upon the characteristics of the economies and the reactions of other actors who may provide abuse or support to producers. From this, we can derive some hypotheses, right? We think that if this theory is true, there are certain things we should observe in the relationships between drug producers and insurgencies. And if this theory is not true, we should not observe those things. Let's take a look at a few examples, right? For starters, we need to realize that opposed to Felbab Brown's theory is a conventional theory, which is that the insurgent's capital is primarily derived from its ideology in how well it appeals to citizens. Citizens pay their taxes, they volunteer for the rebellion, they keep secrets from the state, primarily based upon the value of the political promises that the insurgency is making, and not because the insurgency is providing them with any sort of immediate or direct return in the form of protection. So, in each of these circumstances, as we go through these hypotheses, what you're going to see is a hypothesis marked by H. Which hypothesis we're on marked by the letter, so this is going to be hypothesis A. And then we have a null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is going to be true if Felbab-Brown's theory is wrong. And this null hypothesis is probably going to be more consistent with the conventional theory. Then every hypothesis, null hypothesis we generate has a hypothesis that is consistent with Felbab-Brown's theory. So here, we're asking about popularity of the insurgency among the civilians. And if the conventional theory is true, we should observe the null hypothesis. Belligerents will be equally popular in trafficking and non-trafficking areas as long as their ideology is consistent across those areas. As long as the ideology is constant, we should see that there is a constant amount of support. Felbab-Brown says that this is wrong. Belligerent popularity should differ between trafficking and non-trafficking areas, and that difference should correlate with the character of the belligerent's intervention. So now notice here we're going back to our very old, very first day canard or trope or meme that you cannot explain variation with a constant. So Felbab-Brown is going to attempt to prove to us that belligerent popularity varies, and that because the belligerent's ideology does not vary, because the shining path is always Marxist and always set in opposition to the same Peruvian state, that you can't explain variation in civilian support by an appeal to ideology, because the ideology is constant. So if we observe variation in ideology, it should make us wonder if the conventional theory is true, and if the variation in ideology correlates with the type of intervention that the insurgent group is engaged with in terms of the drug market, that is a piece of evidence that Felbab-Brown is correct. Hypotheses B and C, again, if capital is derived primarily from ideology, we should not see the belligerents bargain with drug trafficking organizations on behalf of the drug producers. There's no point to it. What the drug production families want, what those citizens care about, is promises from the insurgency that they're going to get a state that works better for them, that the social outcomes the insurgents promise to engineer are more beneficial for them in the long run than the social outcomes the state is engineering. But if Felbab-Brown is right, and one of the things that insurgents can deliver is immediate protection for an illicit economy, then we should see the belligerents bargaining on behalf of drug producers or providing violence on behalf of drug producers against trafficking organizations that are abusive. Another potential hypothesis, C, belligerent and trafficker relations should be largely cooperative. If the population cares mostly about the ideology and what the insurgency is going to replace the state with, they might be largely ambivalent about how the insurgency raises that money. On the other hand, these relations should be cooperative. The belligerent should seek to make as much money from the traffickers as cooperatively as possible. On the other hand, if it's true that you can raise major political and military capital by providing benefits and stability to drug producers, then we should see that belligerents sacrifice some of the cooperative, costless, efficient relationships they might generate with traffickers in order to protect producers. A final hypothesis here, hypothesis D, how the government responds should matter. Here, the conventional theory, there should be no correlation between an eradication policy and belligerent support. If the population cares about what the belligerents offer, mostly on the grounds that it's a new type of government that they prefer, they should hate the existing government whether they eradicate or not. On the other hand, Felbab-Brown's theory predicts that there should be a correlation between how severely the government interdicts in the illicit economy and positive support for belligerents, because a rational belligerent should take the opportunity to step in and provide protection and stability to an aggrieved population. Okay, so we're going to test in Peru. We're going to take a look at some variation in terms of the government and the Shining Path's actions and see if that correlates with a dependent variable typically operationalized as support by the population. First, we're going to do just a little bit of background about the conflict. In 1970, when Sendero, or the Shining Path, began organizing in Ayacucho, Peru was experiencing a pronounced economic collapse. The average annual GDP growth rate per capita dropped from 2.5% in the 1960s to less than 1% in the 1970s, and then to negative 3% in the 1980s. By contrast, Peru's neighbors in Latin America were growing at a rate of nearly 3% per year on average throughout the 60s and 70s. So Peru is being massively outperformed at the time that the Shining Path is starting to get moving. Land distribution was extremely unequal. Poor people owned almost no land, rich people owned almost all the land. Infant mortality was sky high. It's 33% higher among Ayacucho residents than among the rest of the country. And we're looking at 17,000 citizens per doctor compared to an average of a little over 1,200 elsewhere. Poverty rate in Ayacucho is also higher than the Peruvian average, and so we see that there is potentially a demand here for a change in terms of how social outcomes are engineered, which government is using its violence to provide which types of programs. During this period, a professor at the Peru University's Ayacucho branch named Abimael Guzman sent his students out into communities in the surrounding region to jumpstart the process of what he called popular education. As teachers in local elementary schools and high schools, they became active in the communities where they lived. Guzman's proteges gathered community members together. They asked them about the challenges that they faced, and they began to introduce peasants to the ideas of Marx, Mao, and of course, Professor Guzman. So here you actually have a liberal Marxist professor who is indoctrinating his students. Fox News would have you believe that this is me. The focus of the rebel activity, especially in the early days of Sendero's movement, was on political tactics. They agitated, they mobilized, they engaged in popular education. Shining Path cadres were sent into local communities to meet with peasants and poor people, set up popular schools, and this gradually introduces the movement to the people there. We're spreading this indoctrination. The movement also provides benefits when it could. It captures cows from rich people and provides them to the poor. It takes over land and distributes them to peasant supporters. At the same time, Sendero extolled the use of revolutionary violence to accomplish its objectives. It was not very violent at this point, but it was starting to talk about how violence was justified. The government at this time, it's interesting to note, is already economically left-wing, but it's an authoritarian version of leftism. Here is Juan Velasco Alvarado, who took over in a coup in 1968, so it's a military dictatorship with left-wing policies. He's pictured here with Nicolae Ceausescu, who's the former communist leader of Yugoslavia. So Peru at this time has a lot of allies in the communist world, but we're still facing something of a Marxist revolution. The left-wing government was later deposed by a right-wing figure, Francisco Bermudez, in 1975. The Bermudez regime was really unpopular with the poor, and he was forced to hold elections in 1980. Bermudez participated in an incentive, a drug eradication incentive regime created by the United States called CORA, which uprooted coca plants and paid farmers for uprooting, and then later in PIA, which substituted coca plants for legal crops. During this election in 1980, a few armed men who were directed by Guzman attacked a rural voting booth and set fire to the ballots inside. They claimed that the election was rigged against the poor in favor of the capitalists. And when the ballot box attack was launched, Sendero Luminoso at this point had constructed an extensive network of cadres who were working in rural communities throughout Ayacucho. The government brought in additional ballots to replace the ones that had been burned, and the elections proceeded without any further incident. The act actually received relatively little attention in the Peruvian press. Sendero Luminoso continued to engage in terrorist attacks. They targeted only government buildings and killed very few people. This raised awareness and money for weapons. They also did this by robbing banks and eventually forcing Peru to declare a state of emergency in 1982. Human rights abuses by the government in provinces where Sendero was popular escalated, especially by an American-trained counter-terrorist brigade called the Sinchis. Here's one example, the Acormarca massacre, in which 69 civilians died. Pictured here is a village reenactment of the massacre, which they stage every year on its anniversary. So this was a very traumatic set of events for local communities. After this point, the Shining Path continued to attack police, military, and eventually civilians that it considered to be class enemies. It used particularly gruesome methods of killing their victims. And these killings, along with the Shining Path's disrespect for the culture of the indigenous peasants it claimed to represent, turned a lot of people in the Sierras away from the Shining Path. In some areas, in fact, fearful and better off peasants formed anti-Shining Path patrols called rondas. These were generally poorly equipped, despite the donations of guns from the armed forces. But nevertheless, they actually took time to attack Shining Path guerrillas. When the first such attack was reported in January of 1983, where the rondas killed 13 Senderistas, the rondas stabbed and killed a bunch of Shining Path commanders and received greater support from the government. As a response, Shining Path entered the province where it happened and killed 69 people, many of whom were children, including one who was only 6 months old. They killed several women, and this was the first massacre by the Shining Path of the peasant community, but others followed. The government, as a result of this, easily pushed Sendero Luminoso out of Ayacucho province and forced them into the Upper Huallaga Valley. And the Upper Huallaga Valley is where the majority of Peruvian coca is grown. So there's lots of employment there. So there's an expectation already that protecting illicit economies will be important once the Shining Path is sort of cornered into the UHV. And there's very little opportunity to switch crops in these places. It's very high altitude, the soil is very acidic, so coca plants thrive there, but relatively little else will grow other than corn. So we're seeing this idea that there's relatively little elasticity in the labor market, and this is a labor market that serves lots of people. So there's a big opportunity here for the Shining Path. Here we see the reduction in territory over time. As we shrink to the Upper Huallaga Valley, we move slowly into this red territory only. And the Upper Huallaga Valley is far more isolated than Ayacucho. Ayacucho has a couple of major local highways that cross there, whereas out in the countryside you just see a lot of green. The economy and the structure of the Upper Huallaga Valley changed the strategic calculus for Sendero Luminoso with respect to combatant and civilian interaction. Coca growers didn't make much overall revenue off of cocaine. They are very poor in absolute terms, but much richer on average than most of the other peasants in other parts of the Peruvian countryside. In fact, cocaleros even supplemented public salaries. They paid extra money to school teachers or provided them with land that the peasants farmed, and whatever money was generated by the sale of coca in that land was then provided to the teachers. So we always need to be mindful of whether we can interpret correlations as causal as we move into more direct testing here. That's the end of our background on the Peruvian conflict. We need to be mindful of whether we can interpret correlations as causal. One way we can get closer to establishing whether a change in the independent variable causes an observed change in the dependent variable is by looking at alternative independent variables. And we demonstrate, going way back to the first week of class, that there's no variation on the IVs that matter to other theories. So Felbab Brown makes the case that by doing an internal study of the Shining Path, she's controlling for important alternative explanations. For example, the ideology of Sendero Luminoso as Marxists doesn't change very much over the course of the war. The support for external actors for eradication. The United States always wants Peru to be uprooting coca plants or setting fire to them or interdicting against drug traffickers, so there's no variation there. The culture of cocaleros, their interest in growing coca for their indigenous purposes, Chewing coca leaves provides a mild stimulation, similar in effect, I'm told, to smoking cigarettes, and it's important for the local communities that they're allowed to do this. This doesn't vary over time, and neither does the demand for cocaine in the United States or Europe. So as a result of these things, we can track the correlation between the main IVs and DVs and make the argument that if this is really the only connection between the independent and dependent variable, maybe this is causal. Okay, so in the beginning, it's apparent that the people don't care that much about a lack of service provided by the government or a lack of service provided by Sendero Luminoso. What they wanted was legitimacy for drugs. Cocaleros are different from the rest of the country in this way. People in the rest of Peru don't care about how legitimate the drug trade is, but in the Upper Huallaga Valley, it's very important that the drug trade is protected. This leads to a policy switch. Sendero, like most Marxist organizations, banned drugs. They attempted to interdict against drug producers and drug traffickers. But Sendero in 1985 began to offer protection to coca growers. And they began to provide this protection and some services to the coca growing economy. So what effect should Felbab Brown predict in a pre-1985 world where the insurgents are fighting against drug trafficking, they're negatively involved in the illicit economy, and post-1985 when they're suddenly involved in protecting the drug economy? Well, that's right. What we should predict is that political support for the guerrillas should switch, right? Sendero should be unpopular in the pre-1985 era and popular in the post-1985 era. And this is, in fact, what we see. The Cocaleros see eradication as a threat to their survival, and when the recruiters announce that they're protecting these livelihoods, the people jump on board. So let's take a look at a little chart here that lays this out, right? Where is the only variation that matches the dependent variable? Here we have the earlier period where there's no support and the later period where there is support. Here we have Marxism in both periods. We have high demand for the drugs in both periods. We know that the United States wants intervention in both periods, and we have this high country Peruvian cocalero culture that's there in both periods. So none of these variables, because you can't explain variation with a constant, are plausible explanations for this change in support. But the Sendero Luminoso drug policy does change during this time, and the direction of its change matches theoretically with the direction of the change that we observe in support from the cocaleros. So we might take this 1987 switch as a piece of evidence that Felbab Brown is right. Sendero Luminoso was competing with some civilian groups that were intended to protect cocaleros, but Sendero had a couple of advantages. I guess I should go over those advantages, right? First, because Sendero was a nascent organization that was attempting to create political change throughout the country, no one expected particularly much of them right off the bat. And second is that Sendero has a lot more guns. So between these two things, Sendero was able to lower expectations and provide better outcomes at the same time. This policy led not only to political support, but also to more money, right? We start to see the amount of money that Sendero can gather from taxing its populations really increases at the time that it embraces drug trafficking, which is consistent with our military capacity argument. And weapons. We move from having handguns and stolen mines to having M60s and G3s, American-made grenades. So we're buying lots and lots of weapons that are extremely sophisticated all of a sudden as a result of this switch. We can also take a look at the second hypothesis here, whether or not there is belligerent bargaining. We see that Sendero bargained with traffickers to get better treatment for drug producers, and they enforced the deal. So this is more evidence for Felbab Brown. If Felbab Brown were wrong, if the conventional view were right, we should see that the belligerents, Sendero Luminoso, would not bother to bargain with traffickers. They would attempt to play these groups off of one another, relying on their ideology as the base of social support from the people. But they don't. In fact, they attempt to provide protection and regularity in these markets. In addition to these security services, Sendero Luminoso uses some of its drug revenues to build public goods like sewers and clean water, and clinics and roads. As a result, support soared, right? We have lots and lots of evidence listed in Felbab Brown that the negotiation on behalf of the drug producers against the drug trafficking organizations produced this revenue, produced this security that allowed Sendero to provide services, allowed the Cocaleros to increase their take, and that is correlated with higher levels of support. So this is, again, more evidence that Felbab Brown is right. Another thing we should consider is the extent to which the state interferes with the illicit economy. The state tried a policy of eradication during this time, and it did not go very well. The amount of drugs that were destroyed was extremely low, and the optics were bad too. This created a sense in which the government was seen as deeply abusive of people in the Upper Hoyaga Valley. And so they try a substantially different strategy from 1984 to 1985. The new general in the emergency zone decided not to think about drug trafficking as a problem, and he sort of suppressed the eradication efforts of the Peruvian police. He shows considerable constraint, right? He allows the Cora initiative to operate only in areas where Sendero is not present or weak, so it directs those sorts of activities to places where it's going to be the least harmful to counterinsurgent support. And as a result, we see that there's not a single hectare of coca that gets plowed under in 1985, which is pretty substantial. Notice that we destroy 44 labs, though. Why do you suppose it makes more strategic sense to destroy the labs? Well, there are a couple of potential reasons. One is that it's not clear whether the income from the labs accrues to the local peasants or to the drug trafficking organizations that are foreigners. And second, the drug labs don't employ as many people as the coca growing business, so you're not alienating as many people. So this is definitely an example of the Peruvian state trying to have its cake and eat it too, with respect to its drug interdiction efforts. It tries to please the United States and international donors by engaging in some facial amount of drug interdiction, but it doesn't do the interdictions or the eradication efforts that would alienate the population most completely. And Felbab Brown is right. This pays off. The guerrillas are forced into retreat. They're being pushed out of the Upper Hoyaga Valley. The army is gathering more intelligence against the traffickers. Not against traffickers, against the insurgents. And it pays off in a really spectacular way, right? The military starts to get more support and more cooperation from the population at a time that it's becoming increasingly abusive. And this should be a little bit surprising, right? You might believe intuitively that this abuse would turn people off, turn them towards Sendero Luminoso. But as it happens in this case, there's no correlation between an increase in abuse and a decrease in support. So notice here that we have two independent variables now with variation. But the violence variation moves the opposite direction of what we'd expect. We'd expect there to be low support or no support for the state when abuse is high, but we see the opposite movement. And so the sales pitch that Felbab Brown makes here, which is the type of sales pitch you will see in other social science papers throughout your career, is that where we have variation, of course, in the independent variable, we want that variation to go the same direction as the theory would expect on the dependent variable. If we don't see that, then our theories about violence are proven incorrect. But notice that there's some intuitive reason that we should still think that high levels of abuse should turn people off to the state. And yet, we see this effect. The effect of drug policy swamps the effect of the abuse policy, which means that the relationship that Felbab Brown is onto here, she can argue that that relationship is more important than some of the most intuitive counterinsurgent strategies we've seen to date. You really, really need to have a handle on how your illicit economy is working if you want to undermine support for insurgents. Well, of course, all good things must come to an end, and after 1985, We elect a new president, Peru elects a new president, and we return to eradication. We've gone from 0 hectares in 1985 to 5,130 hectares in 1988. Quite the turnaround. And the dependent variable, the support of the people for the state, goes back to antagonism. Farmers stopped providing intelligence on Sendero. They start allowing Sendero to remain secret. And Sendero Luminoso picks up on the problem and liberalizes further, right? This is the point at which Sendero really hits full swing with its tolerance and even protection of the drug market. And so we can extend our chart to a new case, right? Here we see again, even though the violence is going down, even though the president, Alan Garcia, argued that the military should be less abusive toward people in the Upper Huallaga Valley, still we see support is eroded. And Felbab Brown makes the argument that, again, the only variable with variation or change that is consistent with its predicted relationship with the dependent variable of support is the drug policy variable. We actually switched this one more time even in 1990. Peru reverses course again, and the campesinos return to the fold. They start to provide intelligence against Sendero Luminoso. They obviously prefer the state as long as the state is providing protection for their industry, right? So there's this tension arises for the state again. For a variety of other reasons, the state would rather engineer a social outcome or interfere in the economics of the drug trade to undermine that system. But every time they do, Sendero is going to find a new way to get involved in that economy and use it to make money. And of course, if we wanted to, we could extend our chart one thing further and demonstrate that in the post-1990 period, you see the yes support for the state. I don't know the value of violence at that time, but again, we've moved from eradicate to tolerate. So we have more evidence, more cases in which the drug policy independent variable correlates in the predicted fashion with the support dependent variable. Okay, well that is all I have on Peru. I will be posting another video shortly in which we have a similar round of discussions in the context of the separatist movement in northern Mali, and we'll take a look at how well Felbab Brown's theory ports to a place like northern Mali. And there are some differences between Mali and Peru that might suggest that we're going to see some differences in how Felbab Brown's theory plays out.